Good afternoon. I'll try to get myself situated here. It's always a pleasure and a tremendous privilege to come to the MFA and talk a little bit. And I'm not an art historian, as I've been introduced. I am a historian, and so you may wonder, why am I at one of the leading art institutions in the world? And the answer to that partially is a course that I have had the privilege of co-teaching with a couple phenomenal colleagues at Amherst College, Samuel Morse, who's an esteemed art historian, and Timothy Van Compernol, who's a scholar of Japanese literature and film. And the three of us have designed and taught this interdisciplinary seminar for about 15 years now, in which we invite students to consider the repeated reinventions of this urban formation that today we call Tokyo. Repeated reinventions in the aftermath of natural and human disasters, including fires, earthquakes, fire bombings. And through it, we use the visual record, art, and print culture in particular, as a kind of throughput. We start with early Tokugawa woodblock prints and go all the way into 20th century photography, early 21st century fashion, and so on. And so what I'm going to be doing today is taking a number of points that we hit and cover over the course of a semester in this class to try to convey to you the built space, the inhabited space, and the represented space of Edo and Tokyo, and try to bring into focus how they differ, right? What separates Edo from Tokyo and vice versa? And this distinction between the built, the inhabited, and the represented is a heuristic distinction we invite our students to think about. And it doesn't imply a linear or hierarchical relationship between the built, the inhabited, and the represented. In fact, we want the students to think about how these three registers interact in often unpredictable ways. That it's often the powerful and the wealthy who dictate what's built and try to use what is built to express political purposes, economic interests, and so on, whereas the people who usually come to inhabit the built space often resist, subvert, or come up with more creative ways in which the built space can be used. And the represented space, the artistic vision, the visual culture, often is free from either of those constraints. It is a place in which nostalgia can be indulged in which possibilities can be imagined, and so on. And so these three registers, the built, the inhabited, and the represented, invite us to think of urban formations as a fairly dynamic space. So with that, I'd like to kind of enter into the first half, which is thinking of Edo. And I want to use as a kind of setting for this, these Edozu Byobu. These are two sets of six-paneled room dividers. This is held by the National Museum of Japanese History. And we don't know exactly when these two sets were made, but we do know it depicts Edo prior to 1657. There was a great fire in Meireki in 1657 when the majority of the city burns, including the main keep. I forgot to check where the laser point is, the main keep. And it was never rebuilt after 1657. So if you visit Tokyo and you enter the publicly accessible part of the Imperial Palace, you can see the stone foundation of the main keep and it kind of experience the scale of this thing. But in any case, the city that's depicted here corresponds roughly to the reign of the third shogun, Iemitsu, the grandson of the founder. And it marks a kind of apogee, a high water mark in which the institutional power of the shogunate was firmly established after 3 generations. And we can kind of safely infer that the artistic vision of these screens reflect the interests of the shogunate, how it thought of Edo as a built space. And so I wanted to kind of use these as an entry point to think about the intended space of Edo, and then gradually talk about how the intended space may not have been as intentional in its actual cultural and social operation. So the first thing to I'm really having a hard time adjusting my distance to the microphone, I apologize. The first thing to understand is that one clear conception of the early shogunate was that the Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the shogunate, had achieved great peace under heaven, that he and therefore the Tokugawa shogunate had ended 100 years of endemic warfare on the archipelago. 100 years in which daimyo fielded armies and fought each other, each seeking hegemony, and so on. And the sheer fact that Ieyasu had brought an end to this was a cornerstone of the legitimacy of the shogunate. And we have to understand that Edo, prior to Ieyasu arriving in this neighborhood in the late 1500s, was just a sleepy fishing village. It was built almost from scratch to be a castle town. And this is one thing we have to really firmly understand, that Edo was a castle town, and castle towns were the final evolution of daimyo, right? Daimyo had to figure out how to first tame their samurai. How do you control the warriors under your control? Well, you move them off the land, and you move them and their families into a town within your domain, and you arrange their housing around your castle so that A, they can be a garrisoned standing army, but you also get to hold their families hostage, right? And this was a pattern of daimyo evolution that was mirrored across the archipelago into the early 1600s. And therefore, Edo was Ieyasu's castle town. It was the castle town. It was the largest castle town. It was designed to control not really his vassals, but to control all the daimyo as his personal vassals. So we have to understand the built intent of Edo, its monumental structure, as it were, in terms of this need to control the daimyo to prevent warfare going forward. And to give you a kind of rough idea of how this worked kind of geographically, this is a map of the archipelago with the classic imperial province names, right? So you would think this is the political map of the archipelago, but the actual political map of the archipelago under the Tokugawa looks something like this. And even this is actually an oversimplification, because the large yellow blobs that are labeled as the shogun's lands are in fact hundreds of different small domains that are loyal to the shogun. The shogun did not directly control all these yellow blobs. But what you see is that the larger contiguous domains, the larger ones, are on the periphery of the archipelago. They carefully place the most powerful daimyo as far away from the vital center as possible, right? So Edo is one center, Kyoto and Osaka are another centers, right? And they arrange the daimyo and their domains very deliberately, right? So that the less loyal ones, like here, if they wanted to challenge, they would have to march through a lot of territory to get to the vital underbelly of the shogunate. This kind of balancing of daimyo autonomy with the central authority of the shogun has been called a compound state, right? The daimyo were given tremendous autonomy within their own domains, but as the personal vassals of the shogun, they were under strict hierarchical control of the shogun himself. This balance was then reflected in the structure of Edo. One of the key, skipping a little bit here. So if we look at the details of the Edo Zubyobu, not surprisingly, a lot of the focus is on the Edo castle itself. And the Edo castle was, first of all, a fortress, right? It was meant to withstand sieges. It was meant to function as a military institution. And one of the ironies is the shogun could not tax his vassals, but he could tell them to build things. So Edo Castle was built by the daimyo. And if you go on a tour and you look along the moats today, if you look closely, you will see inscriptions of daimyo house insignia on certain portions of the stoneworks. They built that section, and this is how they proved their loyalty to him, by building a fortress they would never be able to take. So you see scenes in which there's a lot of emphasis on the martial capabilities of the Tokugawa samurai and so on, but it was also a place of bureaucracy, right? This was an administrative space as well as a military space. It was also a ceremonial space. So if you look at some of the details, you'll see messengers coming, envoys from the imperial court showing up, and you see very ornate buildings with lacquerware and gilding on the edges and the tiles. It's a big castle, right? This is the center of it. So this depicts a visit from the Choson court. So there are a number of recorded embassies from the Korean peninsula, usually to celebrate the investiture of a new shogun, and of course they're going to put this in to emphasize the prestige of the shogun as well. So if we take our time and go through the Edo Zubyobu, you get a sense that Edo is a castle town, first and foremost. This is what it's about. It's a place to control the daimyo, to house them. And the central kind of policy feature that developed in the first 2 or 3 decades of the 1600s was the policy of alternate attendance, sankin kotai. So all daimyo were required to split their time 50-50, spending half of it in their domains, half of it waiting on the shogun in Edo. They had to maintain complexes, residences in and around Edo Castle, and they had to travel back and forth. Their wives and their heirs could never leave Edo. They were effectively hostages. It was a very effective way to control them. It also required them to spend large amounts of money maintaining a headquarters in Edo and a headquarters in their home domain, and the staffing of both and the cost of movement. This effectively ate up, on average, about 50% of their revenues. So you can't tax them, but you can force them to spend money. And it prevented them from amassing surpluses that could be used to fund military adventures, right? It was a very effective way. And so Edo was the end point of all highways. All roads did not lead to Rome. All roads led to Edo because all the daimyo had to go back and forth. And the size of their retinues were strictly pegged to the size of their domains. They could not economize, right? You had to come with as many people as your domain was considered capable of supporting, and so on. A lot of them cheated through the years. They would leave with the right number, and then they would take off their clothes and go home. And as they got close to Edo, they would hire laborers that would put on the garbs and come in. So they did learn to cheat in 2.5 centuries when they got really poor. But at the beginning, it was a big deal, right? And so this becomes a very key part of the built space, the daimyo coming and going. And so in Hiroshige's 53 Stations of the Tokaido Highway, one of the scenes of Nihonbashi, he depicts the vanguard of a daimyo retinue coming into Edo on the alternate attendants, right? There's a similar but slightly different version of this print on display right now. Recommend you go take a look before they swap out. And so again, the Edo Zubyobu is very careful to illustrate the daimyo koji, right? Daimyo Avenue, where the daimyo residences are located around the castle. And you see these highly ornate gates, right? They're lacquered and they're gilded, and they were called higurashimon, which roughly translates into a gate you could spend a whole day staring at because they're so detailed. The joke is these gates, the most ornate ones, the daimyo never used them. They built them for if the shogun deigned to come visit, right? And that was the only purpose. So some of these gates were never used. But the size of their gates were also pegged to the size of their domains. They could not economize, right? So if you had a big domain, you had to have a commensurably large estate, a large gate, and so on. So this was a way of expressing the hierarchy of the daimyo amongst themselves, the hierarchy of the daimyo in relationship to the shogun, and so on. This was one of the central built functions of the city. Where the daimyo were placed in Edo was also carefully balanced, just as the locations of their domains were. So the Fudai are the trustworthy daimyo. These were daimyo who were vassals of Ieyasu long before the end of the warfare. They're trustworthy. They are all located on the high ground behind the castle, right? They're given the most defensible terrain. The Tozama, who are the powerful but less trustworthy daimyo, these were the daimyo who bent the knee last. They're put in the most vulnerable low terrain at the foot of the castle. Close, they're keeping an eye on you, but if you try to do something violent, you're going to be pinched between the Tokugawa retainers and the Fudai daimyo, and so on. The key point here is the city of the high ground, the Yamanote, was entirely given over to the Tokugawa shogunate and the samurai. The majority of the real estate of Edo was for the samurai. It was a castle town. It was a garrison town. This is really what the point of the space was. The commoners were squeezed on a kind of low strip, the low city, the shitamachi, that caught them between the high ground where the castle was and the waterfront of Edo Bay, right? They were just there. The city was not built for them. And to understand this, we have to understand the status system, the Mibun Seido. This was something that had been formalized in about the 40 to 50 years prior to the kind of 1630s. It was a legal distinction. This is not a caste system. It is an occupational distinction. And it was more complicated than the standard samurai, peasant, artisan, merchant distinction. There were many, many statuses. The key distinction, however, was between the samurai, often called the bushi or the buke, and everybody else. And this is what leads John Whitney Hall and others to refer to Tokugawa Japan as a container society. Who you were, what rights and obligations you had were entirely pegged to what status group you were in. Where you lived often was dictated by what status group you belonged to. And the shogunate, the authorities and the samurai did not directly govern other status communities. They were autonomous. As long as they fulfilled their obligations of taxes and services, they rarely directly interact with the samurai, right? They're autonomous. And this status distinction was carried over to Edo itself. So this is an illustration, an kind of reconstruction of what Edo probably looked like in 1640, viewing the low city from the perspective of, or at least from the direction of Edo Castle. And the commoner districts is just this strip, this kind of north-south district. And each of these neighborhoods would be essentially self-governing. The landowners who rented apartments and others there, they were responsible for administering the laws and so on, right? There were very little direct control here. But they were formally marginal. They were not considered political actors. They had no stake. The samurai governed, the shogun governed, right? They were just there to provide services and goods. That was the premise of Edo as a built space. However, there were a lot of unintended consequences to the Tokugawa polity. And one of the key unintended consequences was the fact that a large city, the castle town, invites a lot of commerce. And so the Edo Zubyo book doesn't avoid depicting commercial spaces. So they begin with Nihonbashi Bridge, right? And you get a sense of the prosperity that they want to celebrate, that the great peace under heaven is bringing a tremendous amount of lumber for further building and expansion. And look at all the rice bales that are stocked up. This is a place of prosperity. But if we follow the gaze of the illustrator, we begin to see how the hustle and bustle of the marketplace involves the interactions of many different status groups, right? That in the streets of commerce, the supposedly fixed hierarchy of the status groups intermingles. And there's a hint here of what's going to happen over the span of 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule, that the laws of the market are going to begin to steadily erode what they want to be static, the hierarchies of status and the locus of power. And this will be a very important theme to keep in mind to understand Edo. Another major unintended consequence, is the alternate attendance system. It was designed to control the daimyo, but it also provided a remarkably usable, safe transportation network, right? These highways, right? So the 53 stations of the Tokaido are famous because there were 53 station towns that linked Edo to Kyoto and Osaka. And if you had coin, anybody could travel, right? And you had an infrastructure that made it relatively safe, relatively convenient. And people did travel. Pilgrims traveled. Businessmen, merchants traveled. Sightseers traveled, and so on. And so when we get to Utagawa Hiroshige's 53 stations by 1833, the Tokaido has become a famous destination, right? And each station town has its own kind of story. And so he's able to capture in these prints, right? If you go to Shinagawa, you're going to see the sights of the ships and so on. But the key here is, apart from a couple of these prints, the majority of the people depicted on these scenes are not samurai. So this is the rear end of a daimyo procession at Shinagawa. But here we see pilgrims, right, traveling on the road. Not samurai, right? People in the snow, not samurai. They don't have their swords. And you can see how you could hire people to carry you in a palanquin, right? You could hire, between stations, animals to carry your wares and so on, right? If you had money, the infrastructure was there, right? And at each station town, you have inns, and this is a kind of humorous scene in which women working for various inns are grabbing travelers saying, no, you come stay with us, right? Whereas you see another traveler washing his feet before he's going to go inside, probably have a hot bath and a meal, and the next day he may walk a couple station towns worth, and he repeats until he gets where he needs to go, right? This begins to integrate the archipelago in ways that the Tokugawa did not envision, right? It facilitates travel and information to spread across the archipelago. Here he depicts hikyaku, flying legs. So if information is money, time is money. So over time, the ability to send commodity prices, exchange rates between gold and silver. So Kyoto and Osaka was largely silver-based. Edo was largely gold-based. These information was useful, right? They had it down to, I believe, 3 days, finally, between Edo and Tokyo by the end of the Tokugawa period. It was not cheap, but you could pay. And it's the Pony Express, but they would run through the night and switch off between the station towns, right? They would move the information along, right? And here's one more print with the vanguard of a daimyo procession. We know it's a daimyo procession because they have the spearheads covered against the rain. So here I want to kind of borrow Mary Elizabeth Berry's wonderful, wonderful monograph, Japan in Print, to kind of discuss how the print culture, the information culture, gives us an insight into Edo as a space, as an urban space. And this painting by Shunsho is a really remarkable painting. There's a reason why Berry uses this as the cover of her monograph, because here we see, it's a domestic scene. It's probably a fairly well-to-do merchant household, but it's remarkable because they're airing books. They're airing books so that the worms won't eat the pages. But they own books. They own a large number of books. And it's women and children. And they're reading the books. You see a remarkable sign of literacy here. By some measures, 20% or more of women probably read, which by early modern standards is remarkable. And some suggest that by the end of the Tokugawa period in Edo, upwards of 70% of men probably could read. The reason why it's probably is A, there's no formal count, but also literacy comes in a lot of different flavors. How do you measure literacy, right? Dick Rubinger has a great book on this. But all of these autonomous communities govern themselves. They have to have people who can keep records and correspond with the authorities. That encouraged literacy. So what we see here is this is a society that produced a lot of print and consumed a lot of print. And Beth Berry asks, what can the print culture tell us about Edo and Tokugawa society? One is we see that publishing was a big deal. So at the start of the 1600s, you see a significant number of publishers in Kyoto and Osaka, a decent amount in Edo. By the 18th century, we see that Edo is catching up and will eventually surpass Kyoto and Osaka as a publishing center. This corresponds to Edo ceasing to be a cultural backwater, which it was at the start of the Tokugawa period. This was the ends of the earth by Japanese sensibilities. But by the 18th century and onward, Edo becomes much more confident as a place that produces culture and also produces culture about itself, right? It becomes very, very self-aware. The center of all this is the woodblock print, and time does not permit to discuss why woodblock print instead of movable type. They knew about movable type. It doesn't stick. They revert to woodblock print. But one of the effects of woodblock print is that Japanese publishing was very easy to mix text with image, right? If you're carving it all the same, it doesn't matter. So one of the reasons we see a tremendous print culture with a visual aspect to it is the fact that they were doing woodblocks. Woodblocks makes it very cheap and cost-effective to mix the visual with the textual, and so on. So here you see a carver at work. This is a compendium of crafts and jobs in Edo, and so on. So Beth Barry says, well, let's look at some of the things you could buy. What kind of information you could buy? Well, you could buy maps. And maps, she says, are actually very practical, right? They're very quotidian. And if you look closely, they mark all the station towns in the Tokaido. They name the provinces. They name the domains of each daimyo. They identify where each daimyo's castle is, and so on. Here we get the kind of bird's eye view of how the Tokugawa polity is supposed to look, right? That it's a connection of impermeable urban spaces and so on. And a map of Edo itself follows the same logic. You have the castle in the middle, and you have all of the daimyo houses clearly located with their family crests, and everybody is in their right place, and there's no mingling, and the space is as it should be. But Barry says there's actually a lot of different ways in which people are organizing information. And she brings up something like this. So you could buy an almanac that lists all of the daimyo houses. So this is the daimyo house of the Mori in modern-day Hiroshima in that region. And you get a genealogy of the Mori house. And just to point out, only the men are named. Everybody else is just woman, 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 right? So the women don't count. They're just josh, right? But you also get the full title of the house, the crests. And this is probably the most important information. These are the ceremonial spearheads that would be at the vanguard of this daimyo retinue. So if you run an inn at a station town and somebody sees a daimyo procession coming, you want to know who's coming because then you know how many people are coming in, right? Practical information, right? And so people own these things. You could get these almanacs. They were useful. And again, they corresponded to the governing logic of the Tokugawa polity. But then there were compendiums like this. And this is basically a directory of businesses in Edo. And Barry says, look at this. And it's actually remarkably modern. You need a pediatrician? These are pediatricians, right? But there are no status markers here. These are just people you pay coin to provide a service. And in these pages, Edo becomes a city where you buy services from places, from people that do not correspond to status. And Barry begins to really say, this is really interesting, right? You begin to see in which people are cataloging and consuming information in ways that do not fit. I've got to find my place in my notes because there's a quote I want to read here. But it doesn't correspond to the status system. It doesn't correspond to what the polity is supposed to be. So Barry talks about these prints as something that stands counter to the cartographic imagination. Here the city is porous. Here the city is fluid and status groups mingle. She also points out to the popularity of travel guides, right? And these travel guides promise to introduce people to meisho, named places. Named places become a very important organizing idea for print culture, right? Woodblock prints and so on, but also for travel guides. And so this is the cover, the inside cover of a very successful travel guide, right? An illustrated guide to the famous places of the capital. The capital refers to Kyoto, right? And it's very clear. Buy this book, go on a tour, somebody will help you find your places. And Beth Barry points out that what's interesting here is, and this is a page from the same guide, about the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto. And it gives you an illustrated map of the Silver Pavilion, and then gives you a kind of short synoptic history of the Silver Pavilion. Her point there is, up to this point, the Silver Pavilion belonged to the powerful, wealthy elites that built it. These guidebooks begin to transpose these places, the past, into what Barry calls patrimony, a shared past. They are given an entirely new meaning and an entirely new ownership. Right? So people who read these guidebooks and travel, or maybe you can't afford the travel, but you can read the guidebook, they begin to see the sites, the named places across the archipelago as something that they all share. Right? There's a kind of proto-nationalism that's developing here. We're all kind of inheritors of this thing. And what's interesting then is Edo develops its own named places. And so travel guides of Edo emerge. What are the famous places of Edo? It's not the castle, because you can't visit the castle. You're not going to sell a lot of guidebooks about places you can't go see. So they talk about, so this is Nihonbashi, right? And it's the merchant district. It's the fish market next to Nihonmachi, right? It's the places of commerce. It's where people gather, right? These are the named places of Edo that you want to visit with a guidebook. Seasonal festivals at shrines and temples are famous places. And Barry points out that these are places where strangers come together, people that don't know each other, and they come together voluntarily, and they come together to spend money, right? It's a whole new way of interacting. This is a city of consumers and strangers that you find in the pages of these guidebooks. It's a very different kind of place from, again, the logic of the castle town. And of course, the samurai mingle in too. They're not supposed to be there, but it's really attractive. And the samurai are underemployed and they're bored out of their heads, so they also participate in all of this activity, right? And in some sense, they're subverting their own authority by doing so. It's attractive. It's fun. So she writes, in conclusion to her discussion of what she calls the freedom of cities, she says the following: the city of maps was a place of status hierarchies, occupational and residential zones, visual order and comprehensive control. The city of the brocade and dappled fabric was a place of loosely woven strands and random patterns, detectable in different lights to different eyes. Certainly, the compilers relied on a strong warp of streets and wards, religious and governing institutions. But the weft of commercial enterprise, historical legacy, and ritual activity traced images of ambition and taste. The market rivaled the regime as a source of autonomous power. The past offered all residents a rightful patrimony. The ritual calendar redefined community as voluntary attachment. The social identities so clear in cartography are many and mutable in the urban surveys, which took as their subject the opportunities of consumers and strangers. So we need to keep in mind this tension between the built space and the way in which the inhabitants came to represent and consume that space. Right? This is one of the key logics. And just to kind of build this out a little bit, perhaps the most remarkable product of the print culture are the illustrated woodblock prints, right? The Nishikie. And here you see that the dealer of Nishikie depicted as a famous place. And people are there looking at what they want to buy, and they're going to collect them. And the little subscript here, Nishikie Edo no Meisan, right, is a named product of Edo. And it goes on to say, people from other countries, and by other countries they mean other domains, right, daimyo domains, they come and they buy these to take home, right? This is a famous thing that Edo produces. Well, what do the woodblock prints most famously depict? They depict the floating world, the ukiyo, right? Ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, which is a pun on an old Buddhist concept of ukiyo, which is the melancholy world. But what's noteworthy is the floating world depicted places that in official language were often referred to as bad places. They were aksho, but they were popular, they were glamorous. And nothing was more famous as the Yoshiwara, right? The kind of entertainment district, the courtesan district. It was literally marginal. It was up the Sumida River. It was moated. There was only one way in and out. And yet this too is an Edo Meisho, a named place of Edo, right? They're proud of it. But it was also subversive because this space neutralized status. When you went into one of the houses of assignation and so on, you had to leave your swords. The only thing that mattered was your purse and your taste. Your hereditary status was largely irrelevant. And the kind of socioeconomic story that I'm completely skimming over is, over the 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule, the samurai estate grow poorer and poorer and poorer, while the merchants become richer and richer and richer. So by the time you're getting into the second half of the 18th century, the people who can really afford this space are not the samurai, which is also very offensive. Another bad place, and I'm going to kind of skip through some slides here, is kabuki. Theater was bad, very, very popular. And the authorities shut it down a number of times. But this too was a very, very popular dynamic, kind of motif and subject for ukiyo-e prints. So, to conclude the Edo section here, right, most of the most vibrant visual culture to emerge from Edo came from those who were excluded by the built logic, right? It was in spite of the intent of the castle town that some of the most vivid visual culture emerges, right? It was the neglect, the marginalization of the non-samurai population that unintentionally freed them, right, to inhabit and represent Edo in ways that we today see as vibrant, creative, and innovative. Edo flowered most where it was not supposed to. Right? And that probably is the key to kind of understanding and reading Edo. There is, of course, high aristocratic art that is sponsored by the shoguns and the daimyo. That is its own thing, but it was kind of fairly sequestered. And it didn't have as much circulation as the commoner print culture and so on. So time is pressing, so we'll move on to Tokyo. Skipping over an incredibly rich and complicated story, the Tokugawa shogunate ends in 1867. It goes bye-bye. And it's replaced by something new, a new government that governed in the name of what in English we refer to as the Restoration, but the Japanese term for it has almost always been Ishin, Meiji Ishin, which means renovation, right? It's something, there's a hint of something new. But what's important here is when the Tokugawa shogunate fell, Edo ceased to be a castle town. All the daimyo were sent home. All of their vassals were sent home. Most of the city emptied out, and the remaining commercial classes were left destitute. It was not obvious that Edo was going to survive as a city. Most people thought that was it, right? It was an artificial city built and sustained by the logic of the shogunate. No shogunate, no Edo. Ironically, what gave it new life was the need of the new government for a blank canvas. They needed to paint a new kind of monarch for a new kind of government. And the young emperor cloistered in Kyoto was too controlled by hidebound courtiers who did not want to do anything radical or new. So they just needed to, they moved him. They're like, we're just going to pick you up and move you to the castle in Edo. And since the emperor moves, the capital moves, and Edo becomes Tokyo, the capital of the East. However, what that would mean was not clear to a lot of people. And one hint to this is Yoshitora's triptych from 1870. And this, if you ignore all the wheels, looks exactly like Edo, right? It's Nihonbashi Bridge, except the title says Tokyo Nihonbashi Scene. How does you convey that this is Tokyo and not Edo? Yoshitora just crams the image with wheeled conveyances, because why is this new? Because how you could travel had been strictly prescribed by status. If you were a commoner, you could not go anywhere near a horse inside the city, and so on. So the explosion of wheeled transport was a sign in which the new government, and therefore Tokyo, was new because the status system was being abolished. But you can see the challenge here. What's new? What's changing? And another way to talk about this is what is the monarch going to look like? It takes them a long time to decide how they want to portray the emperor. So this is one of the earliest photographs of Emperor Meiji. He's about 17 in this photo in traditional imperial court garb. Very awkward, very adolescent, very unhappy. But they also tried this one out. A little more confident, still a little awkward, and so on. What they finally end up choosing as the official portraiture that then circulates is, sorry, not this, it's the next one, is this, by an Italian painter, Chiosone, I think. But this is clearly partially a function of Meiji himself maturing physically. He's an older man here, but it really is also the new government finally figuring out what the most important thing is. And they figure out the most important thing is to utilize the gaze of the emperor to completely transform the populace into a populace fragmented by status, a populace fragmented by region, into a singular population of loyal Japanese subjects. We need people to think, feel, and act like Japanese subjects. And the way you do that is you subject them to Ishidojin, right? The one gaze and the equal benevolence of the emperor. And this is what the emperor was going to be used for. And this is a completely historically unprecedented use of the imperial institution. There's nothing traditional about this, okay? And Tek Fujitani has appended magnificent monograph splendid monarchy. And he says it's this visual dynamic that's very key to understanding what the new government does and what it does to the space of Tokyo. It's about introducing the gaze of the emperor so that the emperor can see, but also the emperor can be seen. This is very important. So one way to understand this is all of the prime real estate around Edo Castle is now empty. The daimyo have left. This is all daimyo real estate. So they tear down most of the daimyo estates and mansions, and they have all this open space around Edo Castle, what is now the imperial palace. And they're like, well, we need a centralized bureaucracy. So they build all of the headquarters of a national bureaucracy around the castle, right? The home ministry, army ministry, the finance ministry, the printing bureau, and eventually the imperial diet, and on and on. And these are architecturally hybrid, but they're very modern and Western. And Fujitani is very, very careful here. He wants to kind of drive home the point, if I can find it here, that the importance of architecture in the visual domain and using the city of Tokyo to create a kind of symbolic national topography, as he calls it, right? It was a common endeavor in the second half of the 19th century globally. They're doing this in Paris, they're doing it in Berlin, they're doing it in London, they're doing it in Washington, D.C., and so on. Japan is not aberrant. They are knowingly part of a global endeavor to forge nation states, right? Germany doesn't unify till 1871, and on and on. This is not a unique story by any means. He warns us against thinking about the kind of formation of this visual culture around the emperor as somehow unique or exotic, right? There's the bureaucratic state, but of course, William Coldrake, who is an architectural historian, he says there's another kind of gaze that we need to think about. It's not just the gaze of the emperor, it's the gaze of the Westerners, especially the so-called treaty powers, United States, Great Britain, and so on, who signed unequal treaties with the shogunate in the 50s, in which the new government is wanting to revise. Their gaze matters. So we can see this illustrated in the new imperial palace that they build inside Edo Castle after it burned down. And it's completed in 1888, just in time for the ceremony in which the emperor hands down as a gift to his people a constitution. And the architecture and the ceremonial space inside the imperial palace is deliberately hybrid, right? It incorporates elements of ornamental architecture from what we might call palaces of the early modern and pre-modern Japanese state, but clearly parquet floors, a throne room, there's a lot of velvet. This is clearly meant to be commensurate with the ceremonial spaces of European monarchies, right? It's to be perfectly commensurate, chandeliers, and so on. And so when he hands down the Constitution, the key audience here are these group of men in the back corner here, and these are the diplomatic representatives of the treaty powers. And they are there to say, you are now like us. You have a constitutional monarchy, and you have the proper ceremonial space to conduct this. So the built space of Tokyo is about managing these two gazes, the imperial gaze to be seen by his people, but also the gaze of the foreign powers, right? But I want to emphasize here, right, along with Fujitani, right, that the transformation of the institution of the imperial house and this built space of Tokyo, right, was directed towards a domestic audience, as much or perhaps more than a foreign audience, right? A populace that needed to be taught how to think, feel, and behave as Japanese subjects for the first time, right? This is probably the most important divide separating Edo from Tokyo. There was absolutely no interest in shaping hearts and minds into a unified political agency under the Tokugawa shoguns, right? Benign neglect. Here, the state is now actively trying to grab the attention and the commitment and the sacrifices of its population. And all of the logic of the built space and the ceremonial endeavors are to serve that ends. So the most prominent spaces for the visual performance of the imperial gaze, the double bridge in which the emperor passes through in and out of the castle, and the kind of open grounds in front of it. This was built principally for a domestic audience. This was not for Westerners, right? So this space in front of the double bridge was kept open. It's still open to this day. It is probably the most important civic space in modern Japan. It wasn't a civic space for a long time. And that's the other thing to point out, that they strive to forge the people into a nation. It takes a generation. Most historians say it's the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 that finally gets the majority of the Japanese population past a threshold in which they all take for granted that they're Japanese subjects, right? It takes a generation to do this. It doesn't happen easily or quickly. But what's interesting is the artists participate in this, right? They're not propagandists, but they replicate the governing logic of the state in a way that artists in the Tokugawa period did not, right? There's a kind of, they themselves are now part of the system in ways that I don't think the Edo period artists thought about, because that wasn't their gig. They're commoners, right? They're serving a different market and a different need. The state was also didactic. It wasn't just the emperor. They also need to actively teach. So they take a lot of emptied space, most famously in Ueno, and use them as educational spaces. They very quickly latch onto the idea of expositions. Expositions are popular in Europe and North America in the 19th century, and they began hosting domestic expositions in Ueno. This used to be a large temple, the Kanyeji Temple, which was the familial temple of the Tokugawa. Most of it burns down in the confusion at the end of the Tokugawa period, and they very quickly use it as a place to host a number of domestic expeditions. And it's meant to train the people, right? You come in and you go through in an orderly fashion, right? Exhibitions of commercial products, technological innovations, right? And so on, getting people to think about themselves as be technologically advanced, be entrepreneurial, but also be civilized, right? Be worthy of a modern state, and so on. And this space was also a good way to perform imperial patronage, right? So they have a lot of woodblock prints depicting the emperor and his family showing up to see and be seen, right? It was very handy. They also had a lot of horse races around the Shinobaza Pond, right? They combined entertainment with education and so on. And eventually, Ueno becomes one of the centers of, again, the educational enterprise, right? The first fine arts museum, first conservatory, the first zoo is built there. Today, you have the National Museum, you have the National Zoo, you have these educational institutions all located in Ueno, which are a vestige of this early Meiji attempt to teach, to educate, to shape the population into ways that they think. Now, that doesn't mean they were willing pupils. They weren't necessarily interested in being told what to do, right? Another side note is the architecture here is interesting. One of the kind of foreign architects they hire is Josiah Condor. He designs a number of these public buildings. And I'm not an architectural historian, but those of you in the room may notice that this looks interesting. And what Josiah Condor did is he designed a lot of the buildings that he built for the Meiji state after British colonial architecture. So there's a weird ironic refraction here, right? So he's not taking design, say, from London. This might be from Calcutta. This might be from Singapore, right? There's a kind of way in which this is already a doubling of its European architecture having passed through European colonial spaces, which is now being imported and built in Tokyo, which says a great deal. I mean, again, if you look at the kind of details here around the windows, there's a kind of South Asian twist to it. So silk hats. So one of the things, too, as an aside, is as they try to push this pedagogy, they initially think, oh, women should cut their hair and modernize too. And they very quickly backtrack on this. And they say men must cut their hair, but women may not. And they begin to very deliberately code modern and tradition and gendered terms. So men wear Western garb outside the house, but women are meant to keep traditional garb. And they define femininity and maternity in very Victorian terms. Right? Except the symbol of these Victorian reconceptions of femininity are then coded through kimono. which really, again, complicates this idea is Meiji Japan a place where something foreign is simply being layered on something native, when the very object that's being coded as native is itself modern, right? It's not something that pre-existed, right? This is a very new, the very fact that these women are in public, right? And that they have a role to play as wives and mothers in raising up the next generation of Japanese youth is a completely modern idea, right? So we need to be very skeptical of coding these things naively in terms of Western is modern and foreign, and traditional is native and old. No, it's more complicated than that, right? But this idea of enlightenment, right? Kyochika, a very important artist from this time, he learns watercolor in the treaty ports and really begins to innovate the kinds of expressions you can accomplish through the woodblock medium. He's fascinated with light. A lot of his best prints are about the contrast of illumination and evening and so on. But this idea of light, right? This idea that technology was introducing a universal metric of progress. This people didn't really have a hard time resisting. This seemed obvious to them. This is better, right? Things are brighter, right? This lamp works in ways that we didn't. And a lot of the woodblock print artists and so on were very happy to switch to chemical dyes, synthetic dyes. They're brighter. They don't phase. To purists, they look garish. They're not as attractive as the organic dyes that came before. But the people at the time loved it, right? And again, it complicates the stuff. So to the extent that we see hints of resistance to the Meiji state and its programs, it's not really an expression of nostalgia. It's usually an expression of, we don't like you telling us what to do. It's about the authoritarian or autocratic character of the government that they don't like. One thing they very, very like, in addition to Bunmei Kaika, is this idea of Risshin Shusei. The Meiji period gives us a lot of these 4 Chinese character slogans. It's very useful for history lectures. And Risshin Shusei was one of them. Again, my colleague Tim Van Kundal has written a whole book where he argues that almost all of modern Japanese literature as it develops from the Meiji period forward is ultimately about the story of Risshin Shusei, right? That this was so catchy. People like this. And so it means making something of yourself. This idea that we are done with hereditary status. You can be as ambitious as you can be, and meritocracy will decide. And what we see here is a children's game, right? It's like you just roll the dice and you move up through this stages of life. It's a game of life. So it starts in a classroom, right? It starts with education. And education opens doors. And so you don't want to end up a laborer. You don't want to end a soldier or a rickshaw puller. You want to go to a higher school, right? And maybe you can become a publisher. But if you're really lucky, you can study abroad. Or you can become a journalist. But the real goal, the win, is to rise high enough that eventually the emperor will give you a pension. You will serve the emperor well enough. But this caught on. They liked this, right? Again, very little nostalgia for a status society, right? Ambition, initiative, meritocracy. A lot of contradictions to this. There's clearly privilege and wealth disparity, but this was very popular, right? I want to kind of then bring into focus, kind of in the end here, the kind of built, inhabited, represented by talking about Ginza as a case study and then kind of end with there. So one of the first big infrastructure projects that the new government completes is the building of a railroad linking the treaty port of Yokohama to Tokyo. And it was mainly to facilitate the movement of merchants and diplomatic representatives from Yokohama to the small Tsukiji foreign settlement in Tokyo, right? But Shinbashi Station, which was the Tokyo terminus, this is another Kyochika print. Notice his use of light in the evening. It's a lovely print, one of my favorites. It says on the bottom, Shinbashi Station, right? This becomes the kind of entryway into Tokyo. It was kind of synonymous with Tokyo, Shinbashi, into the early 20th century until it's replaced by the new Tokyo Station building in 1914. Right? But for a long time, this was the face of Tokyo, right? If you were a foreigner, remember the foreign gaze, you would alight from the train at Shinbashi Station and come out. And to use a map here, that's where Shinbashi Station is. And this is the Ginza district. It burns down in 1872. And the new government thinks this is our chance. We have a clean slate. Let's rebuild Ginza to be a showcase of Japanese civilization and enlightenment to the world. And so they begin a project of rebuilding the Ginza as a brick town. So the premise is we're going to use bricks because they're fire resistant and so on. They hire foreign architects. They have in mind a certain neighborhood in London with kind of covered walkways. It'll be a commercial district with residences built into these two-story buildings. It'll be great. Was it great? Well, if we look at the woodblock prints then of the brick town, it's lovely, right? There's a lot of synthetic dye happening here, but it's bustling. You have orderly but busy wheel transportation. You have throngs along the street. The trees are flowering. It is a vibrant, lovely face to Tokyo, right? You come off the train and you walk through, and it becomes a very popular named place to depict in woodblock prints. And it would suggest that this is the place to be. Look how happy people are upstairs. Some people have forgotten to cut their hair, but that's okay. We still have these buildings, right? There's a kind of way the artists haven't quite cottoned on, and this might be a reminder. Maybe they didn't actually go look at the place. The artists themselves may not have gone to see the Ginza, but you get a sense of the kind of enthusiasm. They're really hyping it. They're really pumping it up. Well, how was it really? Right? The story is complicated. Now, the photography is not documentary. I want to be very careful here. I'm not saying that the photographs capture a reality that the woodblock prints don't, in part because we know because of the exposure times, right? So if you look carefully, the fuzziness, these are people walking by, right? So the exposure of the camera tends to erase pedestrian traffic in particular. But you get a sense that it's a little, this is viewing the new Ginza from the Shimbashi station. It's not quite as the woodblock print suggests it. The trees are a little sad, right? There isn't a lot of wheel transportation happening. And in fact, the vision was they were going to temporarily move the residents who had been burned out. They were going to build this up, and then those residents were going to come back and reassume their commercial enterprises. And they didn't want to do it. Every chance they got, they rebuilt on their own in the back streets, and the authorities had to beg them in the name of the emperor to please don't do that. They did it anyway. And even as they built it, they didn't want to move in. The rents were high. These buildings were extremely uncomfortable. They were ill-suited to the commercial enterprises that they'd done. It was a tremendous buzz. The vision was to keep building this out. More and more of Tokyo would look like this. The vision was to kind of go beyond the Ginza. They basically cut their losses 1 year later. The final building that they had committed to is completed in 1877, but it doesn't go beyond the Ginza at all. It's not popular. In many ways, this was a complete failure. And the Europeans and the Americans and others who came to see it, they all thought it looked pretty pathetic. In part because the Japanese carpenters, they weren't really interested or able to build brick. So it was usually the front facade was kind of faked. And they developed very adroitly a kind of faux European architecture. And this lasts for a long time. They're very good at it, right? So there's kind of plaster face, fake front, and then in the back it's all traditional wood framing and tiled roofs and so on. So the Ginza is a huge bust in many ways. And Tristan Grunau, who has a lovely article online at the University of British Columbia on this, if you just type in Ginza Bricktown, it'll come up. He highlights, again, the way the original residents rejected the state's efforts to lure them back. And he says one of the reasons they rejected is they resented that the government did not represent them. They had no local representation in the government. The leaders of the new government were outsiders. They were not from Edo. The people in the Ginza thought of themselves as Edoko, children of Edo. They did not think of themselves as good citizens who were invested in the national project, right? So there's this thing and so on. And so at one point the government asks them to quote, reverently and humbly respect the imperial government's wishes and carry them out with absolutely no misunderstandings. There were a lot of misunderstandings, right? And this is kind of one thing. So here we see, again, the built space, the inhabited space do not align. And the Ginza itself, in the long term, it is a success, right? Ginza becomes, and is today still one of the most expensive stretches of real estate on the archipelago. But the point is, it took the earthquake of 1923 to bring another fire, to burn out the last vestiges of the back streets, where people continue to live as they did in Edo, to really change the Ginza into what it is today. And it introduced an entirely new built logic. No longer is it the built logic of the nation state, it's the built logic of capitalism. And the Ginza succeeds by producing an entirely new subject, not the commoners of Edo, not the sought-after loyal imperial subjects of Meiji, but the consumer, right? And the Ginza then becomes, again, an object of artistic capture, but now it's the modern girl with the bob cut. It is the consumer, it is the jazz age, right? And the Ginza we see today with high-end European brands, it belongs to the built logic of global capitalism and not that of Edo or the nation state. So I don't have a tidy conclusion, but I hope that you will at least carry with you this heuristic distinction between the built, the inhabited, and the represented, and that you at least have a general sense of how we might think our way to a distinction between Edo and Tokyo and map our appreciation of its visual culture in relationship to that difference. Thank you very much. And I would be delighted if you had questions. So they want you to get a microphone, unfortunately. So.
Mike, one second.
In the front, yes.
Sorry, can you raise your hand, the person that had a question?
The gentleman in the... She's bringing you a microphone.
Sorry, did you have a question?
Did you have a question?
Ooh.
No, okay. Yes, I thought you raised your hand.
Using the microphone.
Do you have any of this published? And I know you mentioned several books, one by Barry, is it?
So the number of books that I cited are available in the handout that I hope is available to you. I think a lot of what's covered here is available in the catalog of an exhibition we curated at the Mead Art Museum called Reinventing Tokyo. That's probably the best place to go find and pick up a lot of this content. So we organized an exhibition at Amherst College in 2012 called Reinventing Tokyo, and there's a catalog for that exhibition. Yes, most leading libraries will have it. I think is the correct answer. It's distributed by New England University Press. I don't know what the stock situation is.
Thank you. I just have a quick question. What is a daimyo? You referred to daimyo many times.
So daimyo literally means great name. And so it designates basically, they're all samurai, shogun all the way down, they're all samurai. Daimyo are those who become lords, right? They, through effective use of violence, lay claim to control territory. And to the extent that they can control that territory and subdue local warriors into a well-disciplined, integrated vassal group, they become daimyo. And so that sticks, that emerges kind of through a violent process. So by the early 1600s, if you're counted a daimyo, it means you have a certain, so it's the cutoff is 10,000 koku, which is a standard measurement of rice. So all domains are converted into a notional idea that your domain is capable of producing this many koku of rice. So anybody who has a domain of 10,000 koku or more is a daimyo. That's the nominal answer.
And what year was it that Japan really officially opened to the outside world?
It's a bit of a trick question in the sense that it's a real myth that it's ever closed. So what the shogunate does is they control access. So Nagasaki stays open. The Dutch arrive every year. The Dutch captain has to write a full report of what happened in the outside world, which is then translated by an army of hereditary Dutch translators in the Nagasaki magistrate's office. It is sent to Edo. Sometimes the Dutch captain and members of the Dutch factory of the East India Company go to Edo. They know everything that's going on outside. And Dutch anatomy texts, science texts come in. They're trading with the Chinese. So through Chinese translation, a lot of information comes in. So it depends on what you mean by open. Right? So it's never really closed. But the real opening in the way I think we think of it is when Commodore Perry shows up in 1853. They sign a Treaty of Amity in 1854. This leads to a number of treaties between 1854 and 1858 that open treaty ports on the model of the treaty ports that China opens after the Opium Wars. Except, because the Tokugawa are so well informed, they make it very clear no opium, right? And they restrict residence. So they're like, you can come in, you can have extraterritoriality, but you cannot reside outside the treaty ports. So they're very astute. They trade space for time. It provides them enough time to reform and so on. So there's been a kind of reappraisal of the diplomatic acumen of the Tokugawa. So the general answer is long-winded, is mid-1850s is when it opens.
Now, I didn't hear you mention anything about the monasteries, so maybe could you speak to what happens with the monasteries after the Meiji government comes in?
Sorry. It's a big story, so I'm trying to find the most economical way of answering this question. There are two aspects to it. One is most of the recognized religious institutions are compounds of Buddhist and Shinto establishments. So usually most of the large Buddhist temples are also attached to or in control of adjacent Shinto establishments, because Shinto and Buddhism are linked. What happens after the restoration is they declare Shinto and Buddhism as two different things. This is a completely new idea after a millennia. And so there's a fairly violent process of disassociating these establishments from each other. And Shinto has to kind of invent itself in a way it's never invented itself as a religious institution that stands and functions on its own, which is also the problem with the native thing, right? Shinto is the native religion. Well, it's native from 1868, right? So it's a complicated story. There's also a financial side that these temples, complexes, were given their own essential domains that they were able to tax and gain income from, right? They were like small daimyo domains. That land is taken away from them, and they have to explore anew entirely how they're going to fund themselves. It's a very traumatic process. It takes till about the mid-1880s for this all to sort itself out. But the short answer is, by the end of it, both what we call Shintoism and what is Buddhism in Japan look and behave in very different ways than they did for about 1,000 years prior. That's the short answer for a very complicated story. I did not talk about it. So famous places would have included shrines and temples. But again, there's no notion that these places are religious in the way we think of it. So pilgrimage was a huge thing. So one thing, I could have done a whole thing on how the alternate attendance travel facilitates pilgrimage. So a lot of the ways people were able to travel was they belonged to little confraternities where people put little money in a pool. And then after a certain amount of time, they drew lots. And somebody wins, and they get to go on pilgrimage, and they're going to go there, and they're going to collect all the karma credit for everybody. But, so they think as many as 1 in 4 people went to Ise and back during the Tokugawa period. But the road leading up to Ise in front of it was the largest red light district on the archipelago. So pilgrimage was play. They went to get drunk, they went to have sex, they came home with food and a lot of talismans to distribute the credit to everybody. So in this space, nobody's sitting around thinking, I'm taking a religious holiday versus I'm going on a holiday, right? So one scholar has a great book called Prayer and Play in Tokugawa, Japan, right? It's all kind of complex amalgam, right? This is frowned upon. So when the restoration happens and Ise suddenly has to become a squeaky clean imperial shrine, that red light district goes bye-bye. They build the railhead, the station for Ise, in a different spot so that you got to go to Ise and bypass that, and that district dies. And Ise becomes a somber, clean imperial shrine, right? And we're not going to talk about sex and so on. And a lot of local worship and shrines were about phalluses, and those somehow disappear over the course of the Meiji period. They're going to clean it up because that doesn't look good globally, right? It's too earthy. So there's a lot of fairly violent change that's brought to what we might call traditional belief and practice on the archipelago after the Edo period.
Could you speak a little bit about how the daimyo transitioned during the Meiji period?
How the daimyo...
Daimyo transitioned?
So they're essentially pensioned off. So in 1874, it's a gradual process. They're sent home, then they reorganize the domains into prefectures, and most of the daimyo are appointed governors of the prefecture by the emperor. But the daimyo are actually very incapable people by this point, right? And they want a rational, centralized bureaucracy. And so what they do is, look, we will give you a lump set of government bonds, 1/10 of your annual revenue. And students are like, well, that's not a good deal. It is a good deal because it's 1/10 without any of the overhead. You don't have to maintain residences. There's no alternate attendance. You don't have to govern a domain. At 1/10 is just yours. And so they buy them off, they pension them off, and a lot of the daimyo turn into aristocrats. They turn them into an aristocracy. There are princes, viscounts, counts, barons. They make them completely commensurate with European aristocracy, right? And a lot of them become businessmen, right? They live pretty cushy lives afterwards, right? So some of them are not happy that they're pensioned off, but it's a pretty good golden parachute that they're given. So in regional Japan, a lot of the local businesses, if you look closely, wait a minute, isn't this the local daimyo's name? And yeah, they own a lot of the businesses in the area. So in Kagoshima, where I'm from, Shimazu was the daimyo. So Shimazu runs a number of very large businesses. They did fine. Yeah. Now, their lower retainers, not so much. Right? They didn't do fine. A lot of the lower-ranking samurai suffer quite a bit, and there is a fairly prominent, violent rebellion over that in 1877. It's like the last civil war in Japan, where the conscript army is brought out to put it down. Japan is not a consensus society. The commoners burnt public schools and a lot of conscription stations through the 1870s because they weren't having it. Like, I'm not interested. It takes a while to get them to calm down and accept that they're Japanese. It does not come naturally. The nation state has to be invented. This is a global story. This is History 101, global history. Nation states have to be invented, and it takes a lot of violence to do it. It's a great book called Making Frenchmen Out of Peasants, if you're curious. Making Frenchmen Out of Peasants. I mean, the royal family in Britain, they weren't Windsor until 1914. By that point, it's too embarrassing to admit that the royalty in Europe are not national, right? There is no nation state under the royalty. They have to pretend in 1914 that they're English, not German.
Can I ask you a question? Yes. So in relation in relation to the previous question, I'm also curious to know about how much of the hierarchy between Yamanote and Shitamachi has been consistent since the Edo period, because like I think about like the Tokyo air raid in 1945 when many buildings in the Shitamachi area got burned down because it's vulnerable, it's more crowded.
Yes.
And it's still kind of the same, like we have this conception that it's a little bit dangerous to live in the Shitamachi area because it's not the stable land.
Yes.
So I'm curious to.
So, a useful turning point is when they build Tokyo Station in 1914. And if anybody's been to Tokyo, the Ginza and what is the Shitamachi, there is no entrance to Tokyo Station on that side. Tokyo Station faces the Imperial Palace and the Yamanote. It's really a point, from that point forward, most of the development of the city is towards the Yamanote. They turn their back on the Shitamachi from that point. So the Yamanote line, the circular thing, encircles the Yamanote. The Tokyo metropolitan government is in Shinjuku, which is on, right? And the suburban private railroads all go that way. And so this is really kind of the moment where they really cement the hierarchy going forward in modern Tokyo, that the Yamanote is going to be kind of the main area. And so what happens is the low town becomes heavily industrialized. Right? There are a lot of factories mixed in with homes. It's kind of slummy, and that was the justification for the firebombing. Right? That's where the factories were. And so when the United States burns about 80 to 100,000 people alive in one night, most of it is in the low city because that's mixed use, high density, wooden construction because it's poor. Right? So this is a good way to kind of mark that, the formal moment where they decide that the city is turning its back on the waterfront and Tokyo ceases to be a city on the water. And then in the '64 Olympics, where they fill in all the canals to build the highways, that's really when Tokyo ceases to be a city of water, right? It's all the city of land. So there are certain kind of moments where you can kind of usefully use to mark this progression where they increasingly turn their back, right, and marginalize anew. But then the Shitamachi remains this kind of site of cultural nostalgia, right? So there is a sense that there is a counter-narrative, right? There's a kind of representative practice that challenges the authenticity of the Yamanote and says, if you really want to find the soul of what it means to be from Tokyo, you actually have to be from a neighborhood adjacent to the Sumida River and so on. So it's a kind of conflicted process.
Time.
Great.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.
We'll see you next week.